We recently saw one of the most dominant performances of 2022 played in the India Tata Steel Rapid and Blitz tournament. Now this game here is a sample of this dominant performance. We had Hikaru Nakamura with the white pieces and Arjun Erigaisi with the black pieces. Now this is a brilliant game in itself, and then I also want to reveal at the end of this video how this game fed into such a dominant performance in this tournament. So let's see what happened here. Hikaru had white and kicked off with knight to f3. So we had d5 from Arjun and now pawn e3 from Hikaru. He loves to dabble with these kind of e3, b3 moves, just slow play it, give his opponent the center, attack it from afar. So knight f6 played. Now he goes pawn c4, the classic English attack move. Now we see e6 on the board, and here Hikaru goes knight to c3. So often you see him go pawn b3 here, develop the bishop like this. But in this game he goes knight c3, and all of his play is really quite provocative, as we'll see. So bishop d6, classic development, now pawn to d4, and this bishop now really becomes a bit of a problem piece out of the opening. So b6 was played, preparing to fianchetto that bishop. Now Hikaru takes on d5, again not the most precise here, and we'll see his opponent now picks up the centre quite quickly. So castles was played here, now bishop to d2, not a fun looking piece. Pawn c5 takes the centre, and now Hikaru captures on c5, again not the most accurate. Pawn recaptures, and already after 9 moves we can see black's ahead here. 2 pawns in the centre, controlling these 4 squares. Now these are known as hanging pawns because there's no pawns on the squares circled supporting them, so they can be attacked, they can become weak, but if you can maintain them, they take lots of space. And we can see Hikaru's quite some way away from attacking those pawns when all the minor pieces are standing in the way right now. So castles was now played by Hikaru, the knight developed to c6, and now pawn h3, another sign of Hikaru going a bit wrong in the opening here. He plays both of these bunny ears moves on both sides of the board, but really is playing very, very slowly. So h6 was now played, but this prepares bishop e6, stops knight g5. So the rook came to c1, targets this pawn, and now bishop e6 developed, and now Hikaru just gets a bit lost for a plan here. So if he goes knight to a4, targeting the pawn, black has some decent responses. One is queen e7, and then the knight's a bit stuck out on a limb. Another is knight to e4. If bishop takes, well, you recapture, whoops, pick up a tempo on this knight. So it's pretty uncomfortable. Hikaru goes knight to e2, clearing the c-file once again, maybe bringing the knight to f4. But after knight e4 comes here, well, now he goes pawn to a3, one of these slow kind of bunny ears moves that I mentioned. And after queen to b6, natural harmonious development, well, now the knight bounces back to c3. So Hikaru is literally coming back to the square he just left. Not ideal. Now you don't want to pick up this pawn immediately. If you do that, then white can take on e4 with either one of those minor pieces really. They pick up the pawn back and actually have the better position now, hitting the bishop and this weakened pawn here. So you don't want to let white off the hook. The knight took on d2, good move, picking up the bishop pair. Queen recaptures, and now there is a problem with this pawn coming if you're not careful. So if Arjun had started with the rook a to b8 move, targeting this pawn, well then knight a4 comes, you pick up a tempo on the queen, and after it moves, this is the best move, well then you lose this c5 pawn, and that's a bigger pawn to be losing than the b2 pawn. Not the way to go. So Arjun understands this, he doesn't bring the rook straight away, he pushes on with c4, stops that rook, pressuring the c-pawn. Now this does give Hikaru an opportunity to take on c4, and probably he looked at this and rejected it. So the line would go something like this, with the pawn capturing, queen takes here, the black rook can pick up this tempo, and then the queen crashes through on b2. Now white can actually pick up some kind of small attack on the black king here with these kind of ideas, but black's long term got this passed c pawn, plus some pressure on the a pawn here. Difficult to judge and not easy to see that this should be okay for white. So Hikaru doesn't go in for it, he drops back the bishop, And now we see the rook coming to the d-file anyway, critical battleground, protecting this backwards pawn. So rook f to d1 played. This rook now comes to the b-file, targeting this pawn. So Hikaru defends like this, also picks up a tempo on the queen. It drops back to b7, and now he goes bishop to c2. So he's clearing the way for this rook to come and defend in a moment. Then he frees the knight. And now queen e7 is a really nice maneuver from Arjun. So the job there is done, pressuring the b-file. After this rook comes to b1, then we see queen f6. So it's still pressures down here, plus eyes d4, and there's now a threat to take this knight after bishop takes on h3. So that's why queen e2 dealing with that threat. And now g6 from Arjun, really calm, cool move. Making room for the king, slow playing it. He's got the long-term advantage in the center here, plus the bishop pairs. So rook d2 from Hikaru, making room for the queen. He wants to double against this pawn. Now we see king g7, queen d1, and here Arjun just lets Hikaru back into the game a little bit. So he should go something like pawn a5 or pawn h5, slow playing it, gaining some space. But he goes bishop c7. Now it opens up this rook to overprotect this pawn, but it gives up on the c5 square, and Hikaru jumps in instantly, pressuring this bishop. Now there are some lines where you move this one, it gets kind of complicated. You don't have to move this piece, but we see it dropping back to c8 here, and again it poses Hikaru a difficult decision. Does he take this pawn and allow black to take this one? Again, the line would go something like this, and it's really not clear as to whether this is good or bad for white, because the queen invades, and then there could be some problems around the king, especially when you've got this bishop trained on the h2 square, stopping the escape. But again, should be okay for white, but not easy to judge. So Hikaru doesn't take on d5, he goes pawn to b4, saves that pawn, and black doesn't capture en passant. That would be a bad idea. You free the white position a bit, plus this c-pawn is now a pass pawn, a good asset for the black player, so you don't want to give it up too easily. Now we have knight e5, good move, trying to remove a defender from the king. That's why Hikaru doesn't take, bring this queen in, attacking with tempo. So he should move the knight away, but he makes a weird decision here. So knight d4 is absolutely the most natural move on the board. Perhaps he didn't want to block his heavy pieces from this pawn, so he goes knight e1 instead, but it's a bit passive, not the best. Now we see queen d6, good move, forming a battery here, preparing to move the knight away, and there's another threat around this which Hikaru now takes care of. So he plays knight a4, weird looking move. Knight e4 was another option there, by the way, using this pin. And the whole idea is that after a5, which black now plays, you can kick on with this pawn, which Hikaru does, and your knight's not hanging on c5. And this is what the top players do so well, anticipate each other's plans. And now bishop e6 from Arjun. So he doesn't take this pawn, reason being, then you can go pawn b6, you kick that bishop after it comes to d6, only square. Well, now you can start chasing the queen, and this is even a draw if white wants it, or you can play some different moves. Not what Arjun wants when he's better here. So he doesn't snap off the pawn. Bishop e6 comes back, and now Hikaru here really just mixes it up. So he goes pawn f4, trying to get after the black king. But it's a very weakening move. You leave this pawn backwards. Knight d7 played. Good move. Covers this b6 advance. And now Hikaru comes back to f3 with the knight. And here we see the queen taking on a3. This time it's different. You're about to take here with check, so there's no time for b6. Plus the knight now covers that square along with bishop and rook. So the pawn push is now impossible. So queen e1 was played, covers this pawn. Arjun brings the knight round to b6, blockading that past b pawn. And now rook a1 kicks the queen, and the knight hopped back to c3. So pressures this pawn, also opens up the rook here. And so Arjun defends with rook to a8. And now Hikaru just goes for the king. He's worse in this position, 2 passed pawns for black. So he plays pawn to f5. And this is where he's so good, especially in blitz, creating counterplay. So the pawn is captured. Now we see knight to e2. Excellent move, coming round to d2, then looking at f5. bishop d7 was played, attacks this pawn, anticipates the knight jump, it hits d4, and now because this one is attacked twice by both of these pieces, Arjun kicks on with pawn to f4. e4 from Hikaru. He doesn't want to capture this one here, allow the queens to be exchanged, and now the rook came to e8, and Hikaru brings his rook to e2. Pawn captures on e4, bishop captures back. Now this hits the rook here, and Arjun makes an excellent decision now. He abandons the a-pawn. He moves this rook, centralizes it, yes, gives Hikaru this pawn, but now he starts coordinating his pieces towards the center of the board, trying to use the passed c-pawn as the most dangerous weapon here. And he is still a pawn ahead, don't forget. He didn't get too greedy. Rook a6 now played, pins the knight to the queen. The bishop came back to c8, kicking that rook, and now an excellent move by Hikaru, queen to a1. So he is allowing black to take this rook if they want it, but can you see the refutation if you do this? So the move to play here is not takes. That move's okay, but not best. The trick is knight to f5 check. And now because the king has to stay with the queen or else it will be taken, you have to come up to g6, and then there's all of these discoveries. Now actually, after say this one with check, double check by the way from bishop and knight, there's nothing better for white than to just force a perpetual. But again, the fact that black would have to take perpetual here is not what Arjun wants. So coming back here, we didn't see takes on a6, king g8 was played, coming away from the tricks, and now Hikaru goes knight to c6, best move in the position. Although the queens come off and we see this recaptures, you have established this wonderful knight, and white's now got some ideas of trying to get their own pawn going if they possibly can. So rook d6 played, comes away from the knight's attack, rook a7 invades, hits this bishop, and now rook d1 check came, the king moved, and the bishop saved itself, came into d6, and this is where it's becoming a scramble. You look at the clock times, it's about a minute for each player, and Hikaru plays this very tactical move, knight c to e5. Now what's the whole idea of this? Because after bishop recaptures, if you take with the knight, well after rook takes, although you can check, king takes, win the rook, this is actually a bad exchange for black. You've got 2 minors for the rook now, plus with the passed pawn, this is a winning endgame. So that's not Hikaru's idea. After bishop takes, he doesn't recapture with the knight, he goes bishop to c6, picking up a tempo on this rook, opening his own rook. Very tactical stuff. Rook e6 played, saves itself, best move. And now Hikaru recaptures that piece, but pawn c3. This is the big problem. How do you stop that passer? So bishop f3 was played, and it's an excellent move because it stops this pawn to c2 push. Now after the rook takes, it looks like this should be impossible because you lose the knight on e5, that rook was overloaded. But the problem here is you lose the rook on d1. So that's the whole trick of bishop f3. So c2 impossible, rook d2 was played instead. And now we see Hikaru sliding away to e4, pressuring this pawn, but Arjun overreacts here. So he plays knight d5 to defend this pawn, but it's a mistake, which I'll show in a moment. He should go pawn c2, because now you can't go rook c4 to round up the pawn, and if you go rook c7, well then black gets a big advantage with bishop to b7. Now you can't take, the rook's overloaded, and the trick here is that you attack 2 pieces at once, and the rook has to stay with this knight. So say the rook comes back to e1, for example, well then you can take, rook recaptures, and you take here on f3 using the pin. Very tactical stuff, I know, difficult to see in a minute of course, but that was the way to go, just push the pawn on to c2. But knight d5 was played by Arjun, and now Hikaru, he had this chance to go rook c4, and it should be leading to a draw in this position. You come behind the pawn, you hit the bishop, and there's some dangerous stuff which could happen now with white's own pawn. Eventually these two should get traded, leaves this 3-on-2 on the king side, theoretical draw, but okay, anything could happen in blitz. But rook c4 missed by Hikaru, he takes on f7, going after the king, but now there's rook takes on e4, bishop recaptures, and pawn c2. How are you stopping that one? really not easy. And the best way to play here basically is taking the pawn. You can chuck in a check first, the king goes, then take the pawn, but long story short, you have to give a minor piece. What Hikaru does here after pawn c2 is go knight d6, and he just has this complete blindness. We have the pawn promoting, he's shaking his head at the board, Chessbase India put the video up, not happy, and after this move of bishop h7 check, king h8, here he resigns the game. Now why is this one of the most dominant performances of 2022? Well, this was just one of the games of 3 in which Arjun beat Hikaru Nakamura, the world's #1 blitz player before this tournament. So this was a rapid game, there were 2 blitz games, he won all 3, and Arjun won then the blitz section of this tournament. So a truly dominant performance from the 19-year-old prodigy from India, especially the whooping of Hikaru 3 games in a row. So I hope you enjoyed this one. And a final shout out to Kay Alexander and Omar Pavel. Thanks very much for signing up to the membership. The support's greatly appreciated. And if you want to check out another great epic chess battle, then see the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.